We're about to experience the greatest economic crash since, if not greater than, the Great Depression in the next 2 to 3 years. This will trigger a collapse in the world system that will precipitate an era of global competition. Curious? Let me explain. The more I've read history, the more suspicious I've become of governments. There are more tyrannies across history than free states, and power not being abused is pretty rare. This is why I use Private Internet Access VPN, which is the most flexible VPN out there, allowing you to make sure that no one's watching you. Private Internet Access VPN is extremely transparent in that there are over 30 million downloads. It never records or stores user data. It's open source and the code's entirely public, so you can look beneath the hood to see what's really trustworthy. They continually change your IP address between 75 countries and reroute your internet traffic through an encrypted tunnel and thus hide your online activity from your internet service provider, network administrator, government censors, and hackers. I use PIA VPN both to keep my information from being exposed, but also to watch historical documentaries from sources that are blocked in my country. It's available for all platforms, unblocks major streaming services like Hulu, Disney, and Netflix, protects up to 10 devices at the same time. With all this going on, how could you not get private internet access now? Click the what if altist link in the description to support the change and get PIA VPN for less than $3 a month and 2 extra months for free, meaning only $2 a month and 83% off. Start protecting yourself today. Long story short, the main way to predict economic crashes is to see if there's a disconnect between capital or money and the real economy. The best way to talk about this is that the economy is driven off people making bets on how they think businesses will work in the future, or in other terms, stocks, bonds, and the like. Money should be a representation of stored work, and the market should naturally adjust when a commodity's value isn't being respected. This means to say, when a country prints more money than their actual value, that inflation occurs, since the actual value of the currency isn't changing, but the amount of money is going up, meaning that the value of each unit of money itself goes down. When money isn't allocated in an economy in a way that gives the returns that are expected of it, the money is lost when the returns aren't met. It's the equivalent of how if you buy a new pair of expensive shoes and then immediately trash them, you're just poorer now. Large economic recessions have come from when there's too much money being put into investments that basically can't support the amount of money that they have floating inside of them. The big financial crashes that most normal people have heard of were caused by macro-historical processes. The Great Depression, for example, was heavily caused by Europe's economy being crushed by World War I, with Europeans buying American goods in debt. However, the American economy wasn't large enough to support all this extra European money, meaning it never reached its potential, and so the money got erased. Or take the 2008 financial crash, in which in real terms the standard of living for the common person in the Western world had been declining or stagnating for the better part of 25 years, but no one, including both the general population and in the ruling regime in both business and government, were willing to come to terms with this, thus resulting in too much money flooding the housing market which couldn't support it and the money being erased. The thing you have to remember with the economy is that it's a complex ecosystem in which money has to keep flowing around. It's similar to the environment in which if you make the Sahara hotter, the eastern United States gets more hurricanes. And if you subtract part of the money from one part of the economy, the whole thing comes crashing down. Which brings us to the world today. At the top of the laundry list of reasons why I hate modern economics is that it views the world since World War II as the norm, but in reality it's one of the weirdest aberrations ever. I'm going to make a bunch of enemies saying this, but modern economics and finance has actively misled and lied to the population about the nature of the modern economy and what its underlying fundamentals are. There are a couple things that we take for granted since almost everyone takes everything that's been stable for collective memory for granted that we need to understand to see why the modern economy is so fundamentally broken that it can only precipitate a horrific economic crunch. I think the most important factor here is that globalization has created immense pressures upon everyone except the poorest nations for competition with the entire world. My grandmother once told me, back in my day you were only competing against people in your hometown for a job. And your mother's, it was only people inside your country, and today it's your entire world. This means that everyone's undercutting everyone else. Belgians are undercut by Poles who are undercut by Bulgarians. Alternatively, Americans are undercut by Mexicans and Chinese, who in turn are undercut by Venezuelans and Filipinos. This whole process has resulted in massive gains in the Third World, with the last 40 years being the greatest era of economic and wealth growth in the entirety of world history by a significant margin. Over 1 billion people have been lifted out of poverty. However, this has come at a great cost of immense pressure on wealthier nations in general to compete. Your average first worlder lives a significantly worse life, whether in housing, working hours, health, income, ability to have a family, and the like than the 1970s. This is even though individual productivity has gone up by 70% since the 1970s in the US. Even in countries like South Korea and China that have seen immense growths in GDP per capita, this has often come at the cost of immense competition, with working insane hours, living in crowded, terrible conditions, not being able to support families and the like. Since there's so much competition between countries, countries have inflated a remarkable amount of currency and got into a crazy amount of debt. Inflation is the economic equivalent of sugar, in that countries print it when they want short-term wealth, but it destroys an economy in the long term. It's like you might have a candy bar to perk you up when you didn't have enough energy, but too much candy isn't healthy and might give you diabetes. Governments, which even when they're not democratic are still dependent upon the population, are unwilling to tell their own people that due to international competition they'll live worse lives than their parents. Thus, governments have kept on inflating their currencies and going to debt in order to maintain the illusion to their populations that the standard of living has remained constant or improved. This is a key thing that people almost never understand at the 2008 financial crash, and that there's a myth that it never ended. Well, in reality, it did. It's just the standard of living that Westerners had beforehand was fake and was funded off debt. The crappy standards of living people had after 2008 were what they should have been the whole time. Ever since 2008, the US has kept interest rates low, or the amount of money he will take off the top for lending money in other terms, while at the same time printing ludicrous amounts of money in order to have more money in the system so that people feel less poor. The Chinese have been doing the exact same thing, but to an even greater degree, and basically all major nations in the world are printing money like fiends. Normally, inflation results in currency devaluation, which means the money becomes worth less and less, but now since everyone's doing it, people really don't have an alternative to put money in, so currencies have remained stable while printing money to the highest rates in history. We're the era of the highest debt in world history by a truly massive margin. Another way this insane system has worked is that the US dollar is a linchpin of the world economy. If Egypt wants to trade with South Africa, they do it in US dollars, not in Egyptian pound or South African rand. This is largely supported by the US military, which controls the world's oceans, and in belief in the stability of the US dollar. Also, more importantly, there's no real competition. China and Russia are both autocratic states that almost no one trusts. People need reliable legal systems to solve trade disputes, and China and Russia's somewhat arbitrary governments don't have that. The euro, meanwhile, is so torn by its own internal contradictions, as Greece showed, that it's not even a competitor. The Americans have abused this privilege to a horrific degree. America can spend such a ridiculous amount, and in financial black holes like its military and healthcare systems, since it just prints more money and people keep on buying dollars since everyone knows the dollar is stable. It's a self-perpetuating myth where America gets more money and everyone else gets a stable international currency, but the Americans are abusing it to such a degree that it's impossible for some part of it to not go bust. Any reasonable sort of competition, or even a weakening of faith in the dollar, could precipitate a crisis of confidence, such as people investing in more cryptocurrencies like they are, or in China offering a stronger or more stable-looking competition. One of my rules is the future's inherently chaotic, and so when you make something, you can either create it to be flexible and still be able to deal with the chaos that the future will bring, or it'll inevitably be destroyed by something you haven't even thought of. The US dollar is so fundamentally weak that as the world gets crazier and crazier, there's no chance that something doesn't blow it up for the massive bloated beast it is. I can make this out to just be an American problem, but realistically there are two main massive black holes, the other one being China. It's just I know more about the American debt printing situation. The Chinese manipulate their currency so much that we really have no idea where it actually should be. It could be more valuable than China says, since China exports so much stuff, and they manipulate their currency down to keep it exporting powerhouse, or it could be overvalued since they print so much money and the wealthy Chinese are actively trying to get their money out in droves. When we talk about debt crises, anything the US can talk about is small fry. China has 3 times the debt to GDP ratio as America. In China, similarly to Japan earlier, the big banks were in cahoots with the government to keep the currency weak, to export well, driving to the standard of living, artificially making China more powerful while printing a tremendous amount of money. People have been talking how the Chinese economy could blow up for years, and the normal guess is their ridiculously overvalued housing sector. However, the Chinese government might have enough control over their economy to prevent their economy from collapsing. However, that would involve them splitting off from the rest of the world's economy and turning in themselves, which would in of itself precipitate an economic crisis in the rest of the world. It would also result in China's economy becoming fundamentally broken, as the various government attempts to manage it would just make social problems worse by lowering the standard of living, as switches to command economies always do. Also, to be fair, the American and Chinese economies are so inextricably linked that a crash in one would probably precipitate a crash in the other. The problem is that you never see eras of high peacetime debt without a massive crash afterwards. Historian David Hackett Fisher has looked at peacetime debt across history, and they're normally driven by an era of globalization and economic growth that creates the exact competitive conditions we see now. The horrifying thing is that levels of peacetime debt this high always presage a systemic collapse of the world system, with the ones across Western history being the Napoleonic Wars, the 30 Years' War, and the Black Death. I'd like to stress this. You never get out of this much debt peacefully. China was at 270% debt to GDP ratio before COVID. The US was over 100% in 2017, again before COVID. This is the era of the highest debt ever in world history. COVID has resulted in spending to such an insane degree that I just don't understand it. A majority of US dollars in circulation were printed in the last year, and the Biden administration has just unveiled another $3.5 trillion in programs. Money that'll come from inflation. Traditionally frugal countries as well, like Canada and Germany, have started printing money to a remarkable degree. In general, you know you're going to have a financial crash when things are intuitively really off, in that most of the market works in a way that makes absolutely no historical sense. For example, before the 2008 financial crash, you heard horror stories of cab drivers having multiple homes, and now we have so many red lights flashing. First of all, just look at the stock market, which continued to rise to precipitous heights during the COVID pandemic, right after experiencing the greatest crash since the Great Depression. The stock market should be indicative of the general economy and a healthy economy, but remember, this was when over a quarter of the American population was unemployed, and the government had to cancel rents and give large amounts of money to keep people fed. This largely makes sense, since when the government prints money, most of it ends up in the hands of the wealthy, since the poor tend to just spend it on things that the wealthiest corporations make. Similarly, once the wealthy or large organizations get the money, they invest it in the stock market. Similarly, the skyrocketing degrees of inequality now result in money being concentrated in the hands of wealthy people who mostly invest it. This means that people can be barely getting by on the ground while the stock market thrives, since the economy is so split by class lines. Although, I just want to say, the American stock market is the only major market that's acting this weirdly. There are a couple industries that are just insanely overvalued, one of which is tech, in which the amount of companies getting funding is insane. I have lots of good friends who work in tech, and the range of idiotic ideas that get funded just screams a bit of a bubble. I'm currently residing in New York, and the amount of tech guys who haven't even made $1 of profits renting out entire bars for thousands of dollars a night makes me very worried. For Christ's sake, Prince Harry's working at a tech startup and Obama's a tech venture capitalist. When an industry is this cool, for lack of a better term, that people can be this incompetent, it's gonna blow up. Similarly, although tech has some places to go, it's hit a limit in that we're all generally unhappy with the amount of time we spend in front of screens. Tech has so completely controlled its market that we're all lonely and craving spending less time on the internet. Tech as a whole doesn't have a tremendous degree of space to expand, and now has to compete with itself for the market. Crypto's another thing that's overvalued to a degree that makes no sense to me. Minor coins with no possible trajectory for being a real currency can make hundreds of millions of dollars. Honestly, the thing that gets me the most is NFTs. These are things that literally everyone finds completely idiotic, are literal digital baseball cards, but are getting hundreds of millions of dollars pumped into them. If NFTs, possibly the stupidest thing of the century, are a real economic asset, we're just screwed. When you look at the real side of the economy, you see similar ridiculous disbalances, with the cost of things going up to a crazy degree. Everyone has been seeing price hikes, and it's something that's relatively easy to just witness. The estimates I've seen from a year ago put price inflation at 12%. In my personal life, the price of getting a sandwich and a coffee at Tim Hortons or Dunkin' Donuts has risen to around $13, and it would have been far beneath $10 a couple of years ago. Meanwhile, real estate prices have kept going up as a way to get around the inflation. In the US, there's a labor crisis as people have been refusing to work minimum wage jobs as they can get more off the COVID welfare payments. Similarly, global supply chains have been having problems due to rising prices and disbalances in manufacturing from COVID. As you've seen, a lot of this stuff is anecdotal knowledge and stories. However, that's really what you have to go off. All of this is happening so fast that there really isn't any good data to work with. Also, governments are extremely good at skewing data, and so I wouldn't fully trust the government data either. I'm pretty sure a lot of similar things here are happening outside of North America, but I'm just not sure. All of this adds up to an economic picture that shows that the economy is totally out of touch with conditions on the ground and very prone to collapse. This economic crash isn't just a problem with printing money, but is a brutal transition towards a new economic world the likes of which we've never seen. Recessions are when perception meets reality, and so economic realities that have been coming into fruition for decades drop like a pile of bricks. History either moves glacially slowly or like lightning. There are three massive transitions occurring in the modern economy that in of themselves would result in recessions, but will be tacked onto this crisis, and once the world pulls out of it, the effects of these will be made abundantly clear. The first factor of which is aging, in which Russia, China, and Europe and most of the northern hemisphere will start to get old very fast. We already have a presage to what could occur with what's happened in Japan, in which a rapidly growing economy imploded and Japan has seen practically no economic growth since 1990, since so much of their economy has been based around the elderly. The region we're talking about here is more than half of the world's economy, which will now start to see a long-term recession for decades to come. Economies that are heavily middle-aged have lots of capital since people have money that they're investing for retirement, which is part of the reason we have so much capital in the modern economy. However, old populations have no money since it's been spent on supporting old people. We're going to be entering a no-growth era of economics in which, due to aging populations, the global economy will no longer be expanding due to population growth. This will wreck the fundamental assumptions of modern economics and the way the world's worked for the last 500 years. The second factor is the end of free trade. Both the US and China are constructing trade blocks and tariff barriers and dividing themselves from the rest of the world's economy. The two largest economies doing this won't bode well for the continuance of free trade as an institution, which will leave much of the world out of the loop of trade pacts, thus precipitating a very different economic world. The third is that we're seeing a move towards a digitally based economy, which will have profound effects in of itself. For example, remote work will gradually become a norm, meaning people can leave overpriced cities and move to more pleasant rural locations. Similarly, content creating will become a larger and larger sector of the economy, or even Starlink and satellite-based Wi-Fi replacing cable companies. All of this adds up to a very different economic picture from the world we understand today. Take real estate investment, which almost everyone takes to be an incredibly safe investment, but that's because we're not taking a long enough view of history. Real estate prices skyrocket during an era of inflation, since the real estate is realer than the devaluing currencies. Also, population growth means that there are more people needing homes, and inequality clusters the elite into smaller and smaller areas, while the fewer elite can pay more, thus creating sky-high prices in places like New York, London, or SF. However, if we're living in a society where people, especially the information economy elite, can work remotely, where the population's declining or stagnant, or where governments have eventually become allergic to inflation since the economic crisis, real estate's now one of the worst possible investments. Real estate's often one of the worst investments in eras of stable or declining population, such as the 15th and early 18th centuries. I have no idea when or where this crisis would start. It's normally impossible to predict that sort of thing, given that when one reaches the point of economic crisis, the world's so chaotic that almost anything could light the match. After that, the value of currencies collapses, which in turn lowers the standard of living. As currencies become worth less, the prices for things skyrockets and wages can't keep up. Your average person is significantly poorer. This in turn causes immense unhappiness, political strife, and polarization. The fabric of a stable, coherent society would be significantly weakened as people move in with relatives when they can't pay rent, and with protests, rebellions, riots, and the like breaking out across the world. The ripple effects across the total economy are horrifying. People have less spending money, and so the economy grinds to a halt. Effects in the third world, which is often dependent upon the economies and money from wealthier countries, would be beyond disastrous. Expect countless revolutions in third world countries. People put their money in alternate asset classes rather than normal currencies like gold or crypto. Governments terrified at losing their own ability to control the economy and taxes either bans crypto users using a propaganda campaign saying they're all paying for child pornography, or something that makes crypto government controlled. Over time, we might see a switch away from fiat or inflatable currencies due to them being abused so badly. We could see moving to a gold standard like the US had for 1971, or with a form of non-inflationary government-controlled crypto at the center of the economy. Government and society is already at such a tense knife point that something this big would just collapse the world system, something I've talked about in these videos. Imagine how much COVID changed our mindsets, and imagine it being so much worse. Think of how the Great Depression led to World War II. This recession will likely spark a series of events unlike anything seen before in human history. What a faultist, and thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please like, comment, subscribe, or stay tuned for additional content. Or alternatively, check out my Patreon, where I've got a couple hundred pages of both my cultural history of America and history of the world, or my social media, the links of which are in the description. As always, thanks so much for watching, and have a great day.